So Marvel Rivals is finally here. The Overwatch killer, or just another cheap knockoff. Find out that and more in this week's Tasty Meat Chunks Meaty Monday. So I've been playing a bit of Marvel Rivals, and these are very early first impressions. And I first off want to say I'm a little bit surprised. From everything I've heard, this game is shooting for an early 2025 release date. So realistically speaking, this game is still about 6 to 8 months out, which, as frustrating as that might sound for a lot of people, I think is actually a really good thing because the game is nowhere near ready to launch. Now, before we start talking about this, because this is talking about Marvel Rivals and not Overwatch, in case you don't know me, I am TastyMeatChunks. I make a lot of Overwatch content, but I also make a lot of content on new games that come out that are in a similar vein. I mean, hell, if you scroll back far enough on my page, you'll find Multiverses Club. But let's talk about Marvel Rivals. I'm gonna start out with the good. The soundtrack of the game, really good. The character kits in the game, really good. A lot of people are saying they're very derivative of Overwatch. I don't really think that's true once you start playing these characters. Like, Magneto has a barrier that he holds up like a Reinhardt shield and a projectile that's very similar to Venture or Sigma, but he also has deployable shields kind of like Zarya that give him charges up of his right click, and he can also pull out a giant sword. That's sort of the case with most of the characters in this game. You can find a parallel for every single ability any of them have, but when it gets to the point where we're saying Spider-Man is a ripoff of DPS Doomfist because he has an uppercut, and a ripoff of Wrecking Ball because he can swing, we've gotten to a point now where I can't really take you that seriously. Don't worry, all this meat riding will end soon enough when we get to the bad. I think for the most part, the voice acting is pretty solid. And as a weirdly high-profile cast, got like Yuri Lowenthal playing Spider-Man, Nolan North as Rocket Raccoon, Troy Baker as Loki, Josh Keaton as Iron Man, and even like James Arnold Taylor, who plays Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars The Clone Wars as Magneto, if my ears are not deceiving me. There have been a lot of people complaining that the game is very quippy. For those people, I have one thing to say. Stop playing Spider-Man and Iron Man in a Marvel game if you don't like quips. The vast majority of the characters in this game have some weird dialogue here and there. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. There are some very awkward voice lines, some pretty cringeworthy dialogue. But most of the targeted, I guess, disagreement or dislike for these characters is around ones that are infamous for being like sarcastic, quippy characters. Where it's like, if you're complaining that Spider-Man is quipping too much, I'm sorry, J. Jonah Jameson. You probably shouldn't be hanging around Spider-Man. But for the most part, I'd say the performances are good. A lot of the times it's the writing that is not great. Map design. The maps look pretty good. This game in general on higher settings actually looks somewhat visually impressive, even if it does kind of look like a mobile game with high resolution textures and ray tracing put on top of it. It's not an art style that can't work. Personally, I think the game just needs a bit more cell shading or like some comic bookification to the characters and a bit brighter colors, and it'll really pop and look unique. Right now, it really kind of just looks like Valorant, which isn't a terrible art style to go to. It's pretty easy to run on most things, but it doesn't really have that same visual pop that Overwatch has. Some of the abilities in the game are really, really cool. The idea of team-up attacks gets my theory crafting brain just absolutely exploding with ideas, because if implemented correctly and characters implemented in such a way that like the characters they team up with in lore have bonuses that they give them that allow for a playstyle to be shared between the two of them, that's really exciting because it kind of casualifies team comps. I don't need to know which characters are dive and brawl or whatnot. If Hulk and Iron Man and Captain America all synergize well together and want to play the same game plan, the game rewards me for picking them, which is a really cool idea. And personally, I think is what sets this game apart. The destructible environment stuff is cool, but I think it'll take a while for it to really like sink its teeth into how this affects the game. Characters like Loki, who's like a puppet character, are really interesting and unique. Character like Black Panther has very similar gameplay style to like Genji, with like cooldown resets and animation cancel stuff. Character like Spider-Man is weirdly technical and combo focused. There's a lot of melee focused characters in this game, and they all feel relatively good to play. Most of the ultimates in this game feel fairly impactful, and it kind of like blurs the line between tanks, DPS, and supports. A character like Storm has the ability to speed boost or damage boost all teammates next to her, but she's not a support, she's a DPS. I see a lot of people on Twitter and stuff complaining that this game needs roll lock, but I actually disagree really strongly on this one. I think that the game is going for a much more casual approach, so it doesn't really need this stringent competitive stuff that like slows down the game, makes queue times longer, forces people into specific playstyles. And I think if on the competitive end it's built more around team building, which it seems to be with things like guilds or clans, the whole getting 5 people together to play the game isn't quite as important as it is in Overwatch, or quite as difficult. Pretty much all the characters in the game feel unique, some of their designs are really cool, and some of the animations are downright beautiful. And I don't know if I mentioned this already, the music is really good. Now let's get into the bad. The cherry on top of the bad is the fact that this game's developers do not seem to be very open to criticism. Any content creator who has signed an NDA can have legal action taken against them for speaking negatively against the game. Now, this only applies to content creators who signed up through the content creation area, but it does leave a pretty bad taste in my mouth as far as the developers of this game, NetEase Games. And while we're on this topic, let's talk a bit about NetEase Games. NetEase Games already has developed a competitive Marvel-based IP for mobile called Marvel Super War, which is scheduled to end its service in June of this year. Now, there are higher stakes for a PC game than there are for mobile games, so this could just be a one-off thing. But this company does seem to make a lot of products that are very similar to this. Lots of half-baked, derivative, and not super well-supported titles. Now, to my knowledge, this is the first straight-up PC game that they've made, so there's a bit more for them to show on this. Also, the budget seems to be there for this one, but the developers aren't really like some indie darlings or some people that have some real chops behind them. They tend to be very shovelware app store, if you know what I'm saying. But that's enough about the developers. Let's talk about the bad in the game itself. The art style isn't great. Now, personally, I already said that I think like some cell shading or sort of Spider-Versification of this game could go really far into making it actually visually quite good looking. And some of the animations are great. Counterpoint to this is some of the animations are fucking terrible. Like Spider-Man's run animation is so bad I barely want to play him. There's also a lot of the characters that feel really clunky at a first glance. Again, Spider-Man. You have to go into the settings and disable automatic web shooting instead for manual web shooting to make the webs playable, because otherwise you're just swinging into walls because it grabs the wrong thing. I get that this is a high skill ceiling character, but it makes him feel very unintuitive to use at first. The balance of the game is fucking atrocious. There are some characters that just feel insanely strong and others that just feel super clunky and not great. A lot of the baseline easy characters feel very strong to play now, and I don't know if that's just because they're the easiest to master, or if it's because they're overtuned. That's something that only time will tell. Doctor Strange's portals make your game drop to sub 30 frames per second the second they're put up. So he's borderline unplayable because everyone on both teams will hate you for putting them down. And that's coming from someone who is playing the game on a GTX 3080 with 32 gigs of RAM and a beast of a processor. I don't care how cool the portal looks, if it's dropping my frames that much, it needs to not be a thing like that. Next up, we have a bit of a weird criticism for this game: visual clutter. Now, personally, I don't think the visual clutter is that bad in this game, and I think most of the people complaining about that aren't already really in the genre. Like, granted, a lot of crazy stuff is happening in the game, but this is a third-person 6v6 arena shooter with heroes. They're always pretty noisy. And I do think the fact that it's third person actually helps with the visual clutter a bit. It makes it easier to sort of assess what's going on. The next biggest problem I have with the game is just general movement. I don't know if it's an animation thing or a movement acceleration thing, but the game feels really sluggy to move around in. Also, there's some weird stuff where it feels like your sense changes when you ADS with certain characters. Also, there's just some weird things where, like, the Hulk is supposed to be able to jump onto people midair and, like, slam them into the ground, but it seems really tight on the window to do so, which is crazy for the Hulk. The Hulk should not be, like, a niche mechanically intensive character. Which also, by the way, he's a 4-star difficulty hero. I don't know if it's just that I've played a lot of Winston and a lot of, like, Doomfist and stuff, but I swear he's one of the simplest dive tanks I've ever played in a game. You kind of just jump in and punch stuff, and then when you get low, you pop the shield. Melee attacks in this game feel really just cosmetic. I think if any game needs passive melee attack bonuses, it's this one. Where, like, Magneto has this whole animation where he builds a sword out of metal and slashes them for his melee, but, like, it's just a normal melee. They gotta feel more impactful. And just in general, I feel like the game needs to feel more impactful. Shooting things in it feels fine, but, like, the power fantasy stuff isn't quite there as much. And also, I feel like a lot of the team-up attacks are kind of half-baked. Like, a great example of this is Rocket Raccoon and Groot. Groot builds a bunch of walls that he wants to fight enemies near because the walls do damage, but they also break up sight lines. Whereas Rocket ideally wants to stay a bit further back and use his range pressure and ranged healing to keep his teammates up while protecting his revive spot. But the game doesn't really allow for this with their team-up, because their team-up sees Rocket just jumping onto Groot, which could be cool in kind of like a Kiriko-style flank support way, where Rocket kind of goes in your backline and starts shooting stuff while his revive is behind Groot. But in practice leads to a lot of them jumping on a tank in the middle of a fight and feeding their brains out. Also, this is a very small nitpicky thing, because it's not really the game's fault, it's more of just the appeal to this game versus the reality of it. This game appeals to two groups of people: hero shooter fans and Marvel fans. Now there's a spot where those two overlap, and I think people are going to get the most enjoyment from this game. But the Overwatch players are going to be doing things like coordinating dives, counting cooldowns, and the Marvel players don't know how to do any of this. So I think much like Overwatch, there's going to be a huge learning curve to this game. But unlike Overwatch, most players aren't starting at the rock bottom. The Paladins players, the Overwatch players, the Apex players, anyone who plays hero shooters who hops into this game has an advantage over people who do not, who just want to try it out. So if this game starts to go in a bit more of a sweaty and competitive way, which I think will be a death sentence, it's going to have a really hard time finding new players. We've also just got to talk about polish in general. I've talked about a few of the bugs and things that I think are extremely frustrating in this game. But one of the things that worries me the most is the projected release date versus this alpha. If this alpha is happening more than 6 months away from the release, I'm not that worried about the game's longevity. But I am worried that the devs will see the traction the game is getting and push it out the door early like so many other live service games have. The Finals, Multiverses, a million other live service free-to-play titles that have grown and died in the span of a week. I don't want to see this game fail, but I worry that if they push it out too early, it most certainly will. Because there are some really good ideas in this game, some really interesting characters, some really fun mechanics, and it actually does feel different to play, but if the devs start getting a bit too greedy and push it out the door too early, the game will die. Speaking of the devs being greedy, let's talk about monetization. This game goes for the standard live service game monetization model. $20 and $12 skins, and probably some other purchasable things in the shop. Now, personally, there's nothing wrong with $20 skins. It kind of is the industry standard. But if you're going to compete with Overwatch, I think you gotta lower those prices a little bit. Because if you start hitting Overwatch in the pockets and making Blizzard, a greedy company, look greedy, you get free PR from that. And also, just in general, live service games, stop making $20 skin bundles. Ain't nobody gonna buy that shit if the game isn't good. Aim more for the Helldivers prices. $10 max for a skin. And people will be more incentivized to buy more skins. I do also think the fact that the game is third person means that buying skins will be a better incentive than it is in Overwatch, because you actually get to see the skins. Like, $12 for a recolor is egregious. Ain't nobody buying that shit. Anyways, closing thoughts on this game. I really want Marvel Rivals to succeed and not become another dead live service game. Because much like a lot of those, this game does have a lot of promise. Using a tried and true game type, it's using tested and true characters with a significant budget behind it, in a genre that isn't very competitive, where their only competitor is one of the most widely hated video games on the planet. All of the things are pointing to this game to be successful. The devs need to be patient and let the people working on this game finish doing what they need to do to get it out in time for launch. Because 2 maps and sub 20 characters isn't going to cut it. What this game needs to launch well is at least a handful of maps with at least a handful of modes. We're already ripping off Overwatch modes with Control and Hybrid. While we're at it, we might as well chuck in Escort or like a push mode. Or at least just a couple more maps for the modes that exist already. I'm also excited to see if this game does a bit more unique stuff. I really hope they don't try and do a PvE campaign, because while it would be a cool slam dunk on Overwatch, I just really don't think that's a good idea with hero shooters. And my expectations were pretty low for this game going into it, so I think it should speak to something that I'm actually pretty excited about it after playing it compared to before playing it. For next week's Monday update, I'll probably do another one of these videos, if not in the week leading up to it, with a bit more of a full look at the game. But right now, I'm pretty excited. I can't wait to see where this game goes next.